live. So what we're going to be talking about today is essentials of church budgeting, and there's some pieces of it. Hopefully this is all going to be helpful at the end. Not only do I want to do questions, but there might be some things that you can learn from each other that we want to get to. And as soon as I can get it to decide to let my screen go forward, and it doesn't want to let me. There we go. The first thing I wanted to talk about is evaluating the stewardship culture. And this is one of those pieces, I'm getting feedback, I'm not sure why, but this is one of these pieces that it can be hard to think about needing that stewardship culture piece, because we just want to dive in and do our budget. But the piece about evaluating your stewardship culture is looking at what is the culture of our church? How does that impact our budgeting piece? One of those is a spending philosophy. And you may not even be aware what's a spending philosophy of our church. But if you think about walking into a church that you don't know anything about, what do you know as soon as you walk in? If you walk in the door of your church, of a new church, and you see a lot of decorations on the wall, a lot of flowers and just heavily decorated, then you can see that there's a certain kind of spending philosophy versus maybe you walk in one that's very sparsely decorated, but they've got this big missions wall. You can see something of a spending philosophy. So when you evaluate your spending philosophy, that can help flow into budgeting, just having that understanding. And some of this you may think, well, I've been with this church for a number of years. I don't know that I need to understand this, but sometimes philosophy of spending can change over time. So it's always good to kind of reassess where are we at as a church on our spending philosophy, but then also budgeting philosophy. There are times that your church may be in a stage of maybe just a status quo budget. Everything's kind of moving along. There may be times that you're in a stage, we were just talking about building projects where God has called the church to move forward with some buildings and programs, and maybe you're aggressively budgeting based on what the Spirit is leading. So being aware of where you happen to be at budget philosophy at any given time is important to think about. But also on budget philosophy, thinking about the purpose of the budget. And the purpose is about taking what is the strategy of the church, and then how do the resources need to be allocated in a way to accomplish the strategy. So those parts are important related to that. Compensation philosophy, that's kind of a simple one, but you know that the bulk of your church budget is based on your compensation. I mean, that's the biggest piece. So understanding where you're at on that. Is your philosophy just cost of living increases? Are there merit-based increases? That is going to have a big impact on your budget. And then just thinking about buy-in of staff and administration, that is sure something that can either derail a budget or really feed into a budget. So processing through those things, when you're early on with the church, those may take longer. When you've been with the church for a while, maybe that's a quick process, but just running through those things at the beginning is a good idea. And then moving into a strategic plan. Again, this is another piece that might be easy to think about. I just want to dive in and do my budget. Why do I need a strategic plan, and why is that important? But what you want to do with the budget is start with the mission and purpose that the church has decided. Because when you do that, and again, you can tell I'm used to speaking by standing and moving. I'm hand gesturing a lot. But when the ministry goals should be driving the finances, the budget of the church, when you don't establish the strategic plan, what happens is the budget and the finances start to drive the plan of the church. I mean, and sometimes that's necessary. You think about when COVID hit, you could have had great strategic plans and that was driving your budget, but then COVID hit, and then suddenly finances may have needed to drive the strategic plan. But ideally, outside of unusual circumstances like a pandemic, having that strategic plan should be driving your budget. When there's a disconnect, and a lot of times you'll see that, you'll have a segment that's doing strategic planning, budget happening over here, but the two aren't aren't engaging with each other, that's where you can run into a real disconnect. So making sure that you've got the board leadership setting a vision, but then connecting that to the budget. One of the things I want to talk about in there is, well, how do you do that? You know, having planning retreats with the leadership, thinking about who you want to have involved when you have those planning. Because you think about visionary leaders, you want to have your visionary leaders involved when you're doing the strategic planning, because they're the big picture people looking at, dreaming, what can we possibly accomplish? But if you have all visionary thinkers, you can have a great plan that never gets off the ground. So having those detailed planners involved as well, that take that vision and say, okay, how do we take the steps to get there? Because there's three parts to strategic planning. There's a part of deciding where do we want to go, and that's your visionary thinkers. Where do we want to go? There's where are we right now, and how do we get from where we are here to there? So think about a vacation. The first thing you've got to do is decide, well, where do we want to go? And set that as your destination. Well, if you think about, okay, we're going on vacation, we go to look at GPS, you put in, I want to go to the beach. What's it want to know? What's your starting point? Because you need to decide where you are to decide how to get to where you want to be. And if you think about that as of the map getting there, of having a compass and then having a map getting there, your detailed planners are the people who are going to come in and look at the gap. Here's where we are, here's where we want to be. What needs to be done to bridge that gap? So you want to have those detailed planners available and involved in the strategic planning session, so that you've got the compass, you've got the map. The other thing to think about, though, is in the strategic plan is how do you make it adaptive, or how do you at least keep your mindset on being adaptive? Because again, going back to COVID, there were probably a lot of really lovely strategic plans that were created in 2019 that once COVID hit had to be, readjusted. And I read this story about a military guy talking about strategic planning. And he tells a story about, well, the military can create a strategic plan, but once they get into the heat of the battle and the bullets start flying, the strategic plan kind of has to go out the window, because you've got to adapt to what your enemy is doing, what your situations are. And that's what you have to do with the strategic plan. While you create the strategic plan, it needs to be adaptive and then flow into your budget. And as we think about that planning, and I've already talked about, the visionary thinkers. The visionary thinkers are usually looking at where are we being led in faith. Your detailed planners are coming at it from the standpoint of planning. And there can be sometimes some tension between that two, and how do you bring those to function together? Because biblically, yes, there's biblically that talks about God being sovereign and being our provision, and that we can rely on him. But we also know that we have the story, a biblical admonition to plan and set aside resources. And we have the story of like Joseph and planning for a famine. So we know that we need to bring both of those together. And this quote on here, how do we have wise stewardship without hoarding? And that's sometimes within your team, you're going to have people lean more to one side or the other. And but you want both voices at the table in that. And then also, as you're setting your strategic plan, you need to be thinking about future needs. How do you plan for the future needs? This is kind of the flaw of a balanced budget. And a lot of times that's what we're aiming for. We're creating a budget. You want to see it balanced, that here's the revenue, here's the expenses, we're going to come to zero. The flaw of that is when you're spending all that you get, it doesn't leave room to grow. And so beginning to plan for those future needs, if you know that maybe we're not going to start this year, but in a year from now, 2 years, 3 years, what do we think we're going to need for growth? Going ahead and planning that in as we go. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more we talk about reserves. I know some of you, I think this got sent out, but I'm kind of walking through this whole budget cycle. And this is a good representation. You notice it's in a circle. There's a reason it's in a circle. Budgeting is like ongoing, it never stops. But looking at the planning for future needs and making sure you've addressed those in your budget. And the next thing that you want to look at before you get started, and that's, it seems like lots of pieces before we actually get started, but kind of defining the parameters. This is, again, another place that is kind of flexible and can change from year to year. But on the parameters and kind of budget ground rules, are you going to create multiple budgets? And what does that mean? That means, okay, I make a calculation. I think this is, where we're projected to go. Do you want to also create a budget of what if our revenue, what if our tithes are up by 5%? What if they're down by 5%? The value of doing that is if you've already targeted a budget and created that, hey, if our revenue is running 5% down, I've already said these are the adjustments that need to be made to expenses. The value of that is if you see a trend, you're already set to what do we need to do to adjust expenses rather than kind of creating that on the fly. So it's a little extra work, but it can provide that value and flexibility. Mid-year adjustments, that's deciding, are we going to adjust the budget mid-year? Have we approved some flexibility? Do we need to go back to the board of trustees or elder board? Do we need to go back to the board for approval? What steps need to go in with that? Depreciation is a good one. Are you going to budget for depreciation? Budgeting for depreciation, because it's a non-cash item, is a way of setting aside a reserve for when you have fixed assets that need replaced. So if you budget for depreciation, that can already go ahead and have funds set aside for that. So deciding if you're going to do that or not, that's a good one if you've not done already, to consider trying to build into your budget. And then the last piece is setting and communicating the budget process and timeline. You probably within your church have a lot of programs or ministries, like a youth ministry, kids program, that are going to be providing pieces of the budget and maybe need to be monitoring. So you need to make sure you set what the process is going to be, that you communicated it to them. It's important to think about as you've had turnover in staff of making sure you've communicated. But I know from my experience, even when I didn't, I feel like I had people who just never could remember, what does the budget process look like? What's the timeline? So getting that information out and reminding over and over is sometimes pretty important. The next parameter is method. And this is one I would love to talk about when we get to Q&A of which one everybody's using. But I've got 3 listed here. An incremental is when you say, we think here's what we did last year. We think we're going to be about 10% higher, and you just kind of incrementally increase across the board. That's probably the most used method of budgeting because it's easy. It's easy to come up with, easy to administer. The downside of that is it definitely doesn't take that strategic planning into focus. If the strategic planning says, we really think we want to grow this particular program, then you need to move the resources to that particular program. But an incremental just says, hey, if that program got 20,000 last year, maybe they're going to get 20,001 this year. So trying to get it tagged to strategic is difficult with incremental. The zero-based, a little bit more, less used, a little bit more new, but the zero-based says, nobody has anything given. No matter what you had last year, you're going to zero. Let's look at, what do you need to run that program? What do we feel like fits within our strategic purposes, and allocating the resources based on that. It's definitely not as easy to administer. It has some political issues with it as well, because it's never great to go to a program and say, I know you got 20,000 last year, but this year consider yourself at zero. Come in and show us what you think you need to run this program, or, you know, we're allocating resources differently. So that one's a little more difficult to navigate politically. However, it really does allow you to align with the strategic goals that have been determined. A hybrid is mixing them. And the reason you want to mix, because even if you say, we've really come up with a strategy this year, we want to tag our budget to these strategic goals we've created, there's still going to be some pieces where you're going to probably need to use the incremental. And think about just even your maintenance of the building. It's not like you can go to the utility company and say, we're doing a zero-based budget this year, so we need you to, you know, legitimize why you need X dollars. They don't care that you're in a zero-based budget. So you probably, a hybrid is really a good one, because you can say, okay, for this piece of the budget, these are non-controllable costs. I mean, they just are what they are. But let's go to the programming side and maybe use the zero base for that piece. So a hybrid, and this is not static. There may be a year that you've gone through this great vision and you a 5-year plan, and you come up with this vision and you think this is a year we're going zero based with our programs. We're going to go in, we're allocating the resources based on what God's laid on our hearts through the strategic planning. But then once you've done that work, then the next year you go incremental. So it can fluctuate from year to year, but it's good to think about this. Otherwise, you can kind of just get in the mode of, I'm always going to do incremental. That's not really moving the resources in the fit of the goals of what the church wants to accomplish. That's all kind of everything I've been talking about so far is kind of like, okay, laying the foundation for what we're going to do now, moving into the nitty gritty of it. And that's calculating what I'm going to call the big number, calculating that big number. So still thinking through a little bit of thoughts about this before we do it is, when are you going to do it? And maybe less when are you going to calculate it, but when are you going to announce it? Because again, thinking about how your budget is running, if you calculate that big number, once you calculate it and you put that out there, and let's say you've calculated it and you're calculating a number 10% above last year, I promise you all of your programs are going to go, oh, I'm going to go create my budget asking for 10% more than I asked for last year. So maybe if you say, everybody, you go create your budgets based on what you think you need to run your program, and you kind of hold that big number back until later in the process. So just thinking through that piece. And then the other thing to think about is what's going to be the basis of the big number. Again, a time where something is flexible, it's not always going to be the same, but are you going to use projected revenue, prior year revenue trends, prior year expenses? And there are years that you think about right now, high inflation, that maybe your big number is calculated based on expenses and maybe not prior year, but knowing what they're growing by. Normally, you're probably looking at revenue projections, but there are going to be times that basing on expenses might make sense. But also thinking about, as you calculate the big number, is where are planned reserves going to fit into that? Are you going to project revenue and then say, okay, we're holding a piece of that back for planned reserves, and then therefore the big number is my projected revenue less reserves, and come up with that? If you don't plan, then it's just maybe hopefully something's left over. But thinking about planned reserves as you look at how do you calculate that big number. And then deciding on projecting revenue. I don't know about you guys, this is always the hardest one, trying to decide how much tithes are going to run year to year. I hope your churches are, well, I don't. I mean, some of it I want to say I hope they're pretty static, but really not. You want them to be growing. But projecting can be really hard to do. One of the things you want to do is think about, what are all the revenue sources? Is it just tithes? Do you have some non-contribution revenue, such as a childcare program, a school that you're running, some other program that is generating revenue that is not contribution based, and projecting that may look totally different than projecting your tithes. Considering trends and economic patterns. If you're a church that has typically gotten a lot of stock donations, does where the stock market's at, does that impact what you think you need to project for revenue? So thinking through all those pieces and how you're going to project those is really important. And then also thinking about going back to the strategic planning. There are two ways to kind of perspectives to have. One is, this is how much we will get, so that's how much we can spend. But another is to say, we did the strategic plan. We really believe that this is the direction that the Spirit is leading in. So how much money do we need to make that happen? Those are two different perspectives. It's a lot easier to say, this is how much we think we'll get, so that's what we can spend. It takes a lot more step of faith to say, this is what we feel like God's calling us to, so that's how much we've got to bring in the door. As somebody who's more the detailed planner, this one I'm talking about over here scares me. And yet, that's a lot of times where the Spirit is leading us. It is a perspective, and you want to understand it and make sure that you're using that as you're projecting revenue. And then monitoring heavily. Planning for significant projects. So this one is going to be, let's say if your church has a large youth ministry program. And as I said, my husband has served as a youth young adult minister, which means I've been a youth young adult ministry volunteer since the 90s. So if that's a big part of your budget, how are you getting that information? What is that going to look like? What are the special facets? So for youth ministry, just taking that as an example. So, okay, the youth pastor is going to create that budget. Not all youth pastors are great at creating those budgets, but they're going to create that budget. But what pieces are funds being raised for? Like, are they doing fundraisers to cover part of the camp expenses or mission trip expenses or other expenses? So there's always some facets to that you need to think about, and how does that impact your budget? One other thing that you just kind of got to process through: donor restricted gifts, like say for supporting mission work. Are you going to include that in your budget or not? There's no right or wrong answer to that, because normally that's a flow through. People are making the donations, you're contributing out. So are you going to have it on your budget? You're not going to have it on your budget. There's obviously a good reason to not have it on your budget, because it does impact your cash flows. So sometimes maybe at least having a footnote about it is kind of helpful to understand what your expected cash flow might be. But otherwise, just making a decision and thinking through how you'll handle that. And now I want to move into, again, I'm a handy cycle, is reserves, and I think I keep referring to it, but this verse is out of Ecclesiastes 11:2. Says, divide your investments among many places, for you do not know what risks might lie ahead. And not to be I don't think it's too political, but just going into recent history, if I reworded this, divide your investments among many banks, for you do not know what risk might lie ahead. I mean, we've had this whole thing of where banks failing, and where do you divide your investments on banks. So I won't get into that. But if you think about reserves, we don't know what risks might lie ahead for the church. And therefore, planning in reserves is a wise move. Before I go to that, I want to talk about the philosophy. How much reserve? So I get asked this a lot. That's really subjective. There is no right or wrong answer, except I would say no reserves is probably inadequate. So no reserves is not a good idea. But how much is too much? At one point, I would have said anything a year or over might be too much. And yet in the current economic kind of volatility, market volatility, probably having a year or more is really not too much, just as a protection against volatility that's happening. But why is it important to have cash reserves? Well, it enables a church to be able to honor God and being prepared. It levels out the ebb and flow of revenue and expenses. If you think about your tithes are probably heavily coming in at the end of the year. During the summer months when people are on vacation, you usually take a little bit of a dip. When you have those reserves in place, it allows you to be able to move through those ebb and flows. Also, your expenses, you're going to have times your expenses of the year, the expenses are higher, lower. It also provides a buffer against unplanned events. A lot of organizations, and maybe not so much churches, but a lot of nonprofits, when COVID hit, found themselves with no cash reserves and were not able to weather the storms. And so being able to have that buffer if there's an unplanned event, but also having the ability to take advantage of opportunities. If you think about if your church has wanted to expand and you get contacted and suddenly a piece of property that's adjacent to your church comes available, you want to know that you have the cash reserves to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. And, so planning those in gives some leeway. Some types of reserves are the general operating, which again, that makes you able to handle the ebb and flow, any opportunities that come up, but also capital replacement. We just talked about budgeting for depreciation. And budgeting for depreciation is a good way to plan for capital replacement. So I would highly recommend doing that. And if you don't feel like that's adequate enough, if you know that you maybe got a roof repair that's coming up and you budgeting for depreciation isn't going to cover that, then think about setting funds aside for that. And then debt reduction is the other one that you may consider setting up reserves for. Some tips on creating cash reserves. The first thing that you need to do is kind of come up with what is the target, and in leadership, and you need to think through, what do we want to have? Is that a 3 months of operating? Is it 6 months of operating? What's the comfort level? Or do you want to target 3, but with the idea that long-term we want to move to 6? Because I'm guessing that most of you as churches cannot say today, I think we need a 6-month reserve. And if you don't have it, just today decide to come up with it. If you decide that your reserves currently are inadequate and you want to increase them, normally you need to decide what's our target, what do we want it to be, and then what's a timetable to reach it. Can you handle reaching that over a 1-year time period? Do you need 2 years to get there? Setting aside funds usually needs time to get there. So taking time to evaluate, where are your reserves, where do you want them to be, and then what's the time frame, so that you can begin to incrementally move towards that is important. One of the other tips is when you calculate your projected revenue, to only budget at 90 to 95% of it and set aside the rest as surplus. Another idea that a lot of churches use is taking those unexpected, like the legacy gifts, and putting that in, setting that aside as a surplus. And then we already talked about budgeting depreciation. I think that the cash reserves, and I would love to hear how many of you already have cash reserves, but I think having those cash reserves set aside, the importance of that I can't overstress that. And so that's why it's set in this elements of the budget cycle as a separate element, because it is so important in allowing a church to be ready and poised, not only to get through negative things that happen or a crisis, but to be poised for growth, be poised for what opportunities may come, be poised for pouring into ministry. Imagine that, and again, I'm heavy on youth ministry, but imagine that your youth ministry suddenly has this great influx of teenagers and they're seeing this huge growth. Wouldn't you hate to say, it's great, we've got all these kids, but our budget doesn't allow it? You want to be able to pour into how you see the Spirit is leading and growth, and building reserves pours into that. So this is where you get into the fun part of, for people who don't build budgets, you think, okay, once a year people build a budget and then you're done, but it's not. It's a continuous cycle. And that's because this administration piece, well, it's on here as an equal chunk. In reality, all these pieces, they don't really take that long. The monitoring, the administration, reporting, monitoring, that takes the whole rest of the year. We're spending the rest of the year doing that. And so as we think about administration, having some parameters and flexibility. So what are those? As parameters, are you going to allow modifications? When? Who has to approve it? Which ones require board approval? And then flexibility. Do you have flexibility between ministry and programs? If you have a program that's going over budget and you have another one that's under budget, do you have the flexibility to move those funds over, or are you going to allow an overage in your programs? And so an overage here is going to be covered by somebody who's under on the other side, and just thinking through that. Responsibility and authority. So this is a big one. Who's responsible for administering the budget, and do they have the adequate authority to hold people accountable? And this is a big one. There's nothing worse than giving somebody the responsibility for the budget, but they don't actually have authority to hold people accountable. When you do that, you've got kind of a lame duck budget. Somebody can create it all they want, but if they don't have the authority to hold people accountable, you're probably not going to accomplish what you're looking for here. So making sure those go together. And then thinking about the programs and the ministry leaders, are they going to own that budget? Like, they've created the budget, are they responsible for monitoring their own expenditures? Are you trying to somebody else trying to monitor on their behalf, and how's that going to work? And then how do you deal with the use it or lose it approach? This is my least favorite of creating a budget, that you have programs and people who think, you gave it to me, if I don't use it, you're not giving it to me next year. I'm going to use it up. So processing through what sort of incentives can we give? Because you all know that within your churches, you've probably got a ministry that has somebody who's very careful. They monitor their budget really well. They're going to come in under budget. They look over at this other department that they see as not managing their budget. They're not paying attention. They're over budget. And this person over here thinks, well, why do I bother managing my budget? It's just going to cover their overage. What incentives can you give to this person to manage better, but also continue to give incentives to the person who's already doing a good job, and trying to work that through. Reporting. What kind of reporting are you going to do? This is another area that I think sharing amongst each other would be good. Does your accounting software already provide some budgeting that's usable, especially when it comes to the different departments? Are you pulling that down into Excel? What are you doing as far as creating the reports? What do you need? Who all needs to be receiving it? Again, if your programs, if the different programs are doing oversight of their own piece, then getting reporting out to them.
Yeah, I got the whole piece. If that's different.
Oh,
okay. Okay. Go ahead.
And then the monitoring piece of what are you doing to monitor? This is the biggest chunk of the time. It's important to assess, how is your church performing relative to your projections? You've got to identify those issues so that you can make whatever changes are needed. If you're not monitoring, and say your tithes are sliding, and if you don't recognize that and begin to address that And either what do we need to do to get the tires turned back up, or if we're just really tracking below what we projected for this time frame, do we need to tighten our belt on expenses? If you don't monitor, it begins to eat into reserves. And so making sure that you are monitoring both on a broad picture, but also on a program level. If say that youth ministry is going bonkers and they're overspending, is somebody monitoring that and paying attention of what needs to be done? And then also thinking about how are you monitoring it? You know that you can't just take your budget and divide it by 12 because you know your tithes aren't coming in equally monthly. You know your expenses aren't going out equally monthly. Of how are you going to monitor? And usually the idea of comparing actual year to date to prior year to date is a good way to look at it, so that you're looking at the same time frames, because you normally have the same ebb and flows month to month. And thinking about having status meetings, we all hate to be in more meetings than we need to, but do you need to have status meetings where you're bringing everybody up to date? That can be really important when you see some slide on your tithes, to get everybody on board, not only to be praying about what's going on, but to make sure everybody's on board that we need to pull expenses in. If that's not communicated, you can't be the only person that knows that. So having those status meetings is important. And my last statement, that lack of monitoring can really impact your cash reserves. If you're trying to build cash reserves and you have built it into your budget, when you're not monitoring properly, that can evaporate. But the other problem is, if you feel like I didn't need to build any cash reserves, it's already set aside, the lack of monitoring can begin to eat into cash reserves that have already been completely established. So that are some things. And I know I talked really fast, and as I said, I can get really excited about this. There were a couple of things I kind of highlighted throughout, but I want to move into a time for question and answer. And then if there are ideas that any of you have on some of these things, on how are you doing your budget? What's your budget basis? What kind of software are you using? How do you avoid this use it or lose it? How do you get buy-in by everybody? I think that's one that I probably can't give an answer, but you guys might have some good ideas for each other. So what sort of questions do you have?
Anyone? I mean, I've got a few, but I'll hold off in case there's anyone else. Or I'll jump in here. Okay, you keep thinking. One of the things on reserves, not a question, but a comment, I guess, that I've experienced is that I think one of the other benefits is that by having a buffer, you really allow your leadership board to get out of crisis mentality. And that's something that I saw when we would get close. Suddenly our whole, either it's finance or entire leadership board is that's their focus, right? And it sucks up the energy from other stuff they could be doing, right? So it's a sort of an opportunity cost. So that's one of the things that
is a really good point.
Yeah. So really, yeah, it gives you that buffer. I mean, what's the saying? The great benefit of having money is that you don't have to think about it, right? And it's, for an organization, is true too. So that's one thing that we noticed, and we were able to create some reserve, because of some of the government money we got recently. So that's been nice. That's sort of like unexpected money, you said, and that we've been able to build a reserve. And I think what it was is we've been talking about it for several years as a finance committee. So the stage was set. We talked about it. We agonized about it. We weren't able to really, spend much beneath what we made. But because we just had talked about it and had set that stage, then when the time was ripe, we were able to capitalize on it a little bit. So that's just
Aaron, the point that you made in that I think is really good. It is hard to say, we need everything that's coming in, we're spending. but if you can kind of build into that mindset of, are there some changes that we can make that maybe we can't put a lot into reserves, but can we chip away a little bit at it each year, so that you've at least got a base, and when those extra windfalls come in, that you can add to it. Because as I talked about, having that target and timetable, just as you said, it can be something that we all want to do, but we're not starting on.
And it went to how we started reporting. We got much more intentional about one of the key metrics we were reporting was our available cash, unrestricted available cash, and reporting that not just as a dollar figure, but as a monthly figure. And so people could see, well, we got 25 days of expenses. That seems kind of low, you know? And so to begin to help people see that problem, and creating a metric that allowed us to put it forward then. So I'm interested too in everybody and how they're doing their budgets, whether they're incremental, zero-based, hybrid. We're basically incremental. And I think part of that is because we don't have a strategic plan right now. So we don't have anything to base a zero base on, right? So it's incremental. But I'm curious how others are doing on that.
Is anyone using zero-based, or at least for a segment?
We are, it's Mary Ann. We go back to all of our programs, committees, in August, to have them start thinking about where they think or what events or what they want to do with their ministries next year, and try to figure out, is that what they have now too much, not enough? I'm really blessed that I'm in a church that isn't selfish. The committees aren't selfish. Committees know when a program has run its course and it's time to pull up the plug, and then we have our governing board and wonderful pastors that come up with fabulous new ideas. And so when we are putting together the next year's budget, we add those new programs in and take some other program money of committees that no longer are going to be in existence. And I think it's use or lose. In the past, early on when I was at the church, I've been there for almost 18 years. So we had, I've got to use every penny and I think the pandemic has taught, just because you don't spend it this year doesn't mean that we're not going to give it to you next year, because really coming out of the pandemic, we're all reevaluating what the new way of doing church is. And so focus and money needs to change from we've always done it that way to, well, this is where we're going and how we will continue to do business.
Oh, that's great. Are you still doing incremental on pieces like your general administration piece?
Not well. Utilities, payroll, stuff that is fixed costs.
Yeah.
We are, but and we also budget for capital improvements. Since I've been there, and most of you know, we plan our capital improvements 4 years out, and then take a quarter of those costs and add it to the property budget each year. And then we put it in a designated restricted fund, so that when we need the new roof or the new $100,000 air handler, we have it in the bank and we just write the check.
That's great.
Yeah, Mary Ann is blessed. Yeah. And she's a blessing. Yeah.
So hi, everyone. East Friendship, we also budget incrementally. And prior to COVID, we would get all of our ministries together individually, really, and just talk with them about what their plans are, what their programs are for the coming year, and also talk to them about the current year, how much they've spent and things like that. And those that didn't utilize all their budget, we wouldn't do use or lose any of those sorts of things, but we would to ask them really just to uh, don't just put in a figure, really think about what you're going to do for the coming year. And then, of course, during COVID, a lot of our ministries were dormant. They didn't do much. They didn't need any funding. So we've gotten away from bringing them together. And so we may be going back to that. I'm not sure, but that may be a possibility as the ministries, gear up again to do different things. We are on Monday, we're going to be looking at our doing a mid-year review just to see how we've done the first 3 months of the year and making adjustments if necessary at that point.
I kind of, it's like, I want to ask this and I don't want anyone to feel like they can't answer. Are any of the churches doing really strategic planning in a way that's kind of building into your budget?
No, we aren't. East Friendship is not.
We are, after coming out of COVID last summer, we had backyard talks. Small groups would meet in some of our elders' backyards and have conversations about where members where we wanted the church to go. And we came away with, we really want to be mission focused, and that's where a lot of our budget is now going to: outreach and local mission, and adopting refugee families, and getting them acclimated into our area.
So then that really fed into your budget as far as allocating resources to those pieces that were part of the strategic goals.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Plus, I love the idea of backyard talks.
I'm curious,
Any
Helen
other
or
burning questions?
Kenneth, any how you guys do your budgets, or you feel like you got it perfected?
Perfected. I don't know about that. Yeah, we do it incrementally as well. We look previous year, what ministry had done. And then we ask them to submit proposals, and then we go through those proposals and we adjust accordingly. We, approve a proposal or deny one, but primarily it's based on the previous year. Now, obviously we had to do things a little differently this year because of COVID. But historically we took those matters into account as well.
At Fort Foote, we probably followed the same example as Kenneth, and also what the other two, Cheryl and Sherry and the others, said. We pre-COVID, we always put a proposal out for the ministries and committees to come back with us with their wish list. And it's a justifiable wish list. It's just not a, give me all I can get wish list. And it has to be focused on the vision of the church. Then we have set aside funds to maintain a reserve for our operating projects, and also for our budget items that were unexpected. For example, we have to replace our HVAC system. We were blessed enough when COVID hit I reduced all of our contracts to half or to a quarter, because we were closed most of the time and we were streaming. So I did more for our streaming efforts to ensure that we could communicate with our membership, but I reduced everything else. And of course, with that, if we're not in the building, utility cost is down. And so we benefit from that. The blessing is that once we were open with our membership, and while we probably did still lose some members, we were able to pay off our church during COVID.
Oh, wow.
So that's a blessing there.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we have now realized though that we do need a new HVAC system, and I'm meeting with the trustees today to go over the 3 proposals we have. But the good thing about it is that we don't mind stepping outside the box and hiring a consultant that will help us to better understand what these processes are, particularly if we don't have anyone that's a member of the church. So we invested in a project manager that she's an electrical engineer. So we have her monitoring and making the recommendations to us. Now, granted, we will make the final recommendation or the selection, but those are the things we looked at to try to save us some money on the opposite end, to include any incentives that Pepco may have or Washington Gas may have, so those are other means of us trying to be good stewards of God's money.
Anybody else? I'm sure there's more questions, more to discuss, but thank you, Julie, for your time. Really appreciate it.
And I have a question. Can we get a copy of the presentation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, and in case you didn't get the budget cycle, I think Aaron, you already have that, but I'll get the slides out as well. And if you can follow my notes, I'll send my notes as well. They may be a little sketchier than a little sketchy to read, but I think you'll be able to follow them.
It's a good presentation. We'll be able to follow along.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's been great. I love seeing all these faces, and bless your churches and the ministry, and excited to see how we know that ministry is about God and His Spirit moving, but we also know it's finance people, that it does take funds to actually move some of these pieces. And so thank you for your diligence and what you're doing to expand the kingdom.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I tell my finance team a lot too, there's really that tension between, being good planners, good business people, but also realizing that this is not just the business, it's God's work.
I always add to that, Aaron, and say, while we are faith-based, we are also an organization.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It depends. I think it depends on who's in your meetings too, right?
It depends on who your audience is.
Yeah, it does. Yep.
Which way you say it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you,
All
Julie.
right, well, you all have a blessed day. Thank you for letting me join you today.
Take care. Thank you
very much.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.